All right, everyone. This is another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum, and for this episode, I'm here with Alyssa.
Hi, my name is Alyssa. I got to know John, like many before me, parasocially and then turned it social because of emailing about the podcast.
Yeah, like Maddie said in one of the episodes, you too can transcend the parasocial relationship by just reaching out to me and asking.
Yeah, I think my email was first saying, how did you access all my middle school and high school journals? I kept those on notebook paper.
Yeah.
And the other questions were, do you have any plans on speaking more about high control situations or fundamentalist situations and autistic experiences of those?
Yes, and the answer was yes, but I need to prepare for those. And it's been a couple months, and I'm prepared for those now. And so we're going to talk about that. And because Alyssa, so in the previous episodes about sex and gender, Maddie was the one who was pestering me about it. So I said, you're going to come on and you're going to act as the audience surrogate for that. Alyssa, for pestering me about it, is being punished by being brought on the podcast to talk about that. So,
What could go wrong?
yes, what could go wrong? So, we are going to spend this episode talking about fundamentalism and Christian fundamentalism and the intersection between Christian fundamentalism and autism. When I say the word fundamentalist, Alyssa, what images does that conjure up into your mind?
Mm, I think of the So I know that evangelicalism is at some point, it was like a reaction against fundamentalism. However, it was not totally separate. They still had some overlapping assumptions and theological convictions. I'm not a scholar of the history of those things. I just live in an area with a lot of evangelicals and fundamentalists. When I was a kid, I would have said the fundamentalists were the kids at church who were in a Bill Gothard style homeschool situation. That's where I would have put that. I don't think I would disagree with my younger self about that assumption.
Yeah, yeah. So that definitely is the impression that you get with fundamentalism. However, fundamentalism is unfortunately a very slippery term, and a lot of people call conservative evangelicals fundamentalists or just regular evangelicals fundamentalists. I regularly get accused of being a fundamentalist because I think the Nicene Creed is important, and I think that other Christians should adhere to it if they're calling themselves Christian. That gets me called a fundamentalist. Fundamentalism has many meanings. In common parlance, it means person who is more theologically conservative than me, whom I do not like. Uh, However, that's not a particularly good or useful definition. So I think it's important to talk about how the term developed and then how it started getting used and where we are now. This is mostly a term that comes out of American Protestantism. In the 1920s, there was a movement to combat theological liberalism arising in the church, and they came up with the fundamentals. And the fundamentals were a set of principles, and these sets of principles guided what fundamentalists were. It was a basically a series of essays that came out, and the fundamentals were things like the essentials of the virgin birth, the deity of Christ, the purpose of the incarnation, things like the historicity of the Bible and the infallibility of the biblical text, the fallacies of higher criticism, hard in the justification by faith alone, and a whole bunch of things like that. So it was a response to basically theological liberalism popping up in the early 20th century. And these people published the essays called the Fundamentals, and the ones who stuck to them were labeled fundamentalists because of that. And so, fundamentalists tend to be very culturally conservative American Protestants. However, the term fundamentalism today is basically used for hardline, mostly American religious groups that hold to theologically conservative and politically conservative ideologies. And that's where it gets used now. So, like you said, the evangelical movement came out of a sort of reaction against the fundamentalists, and it starts to develop where they're like, we aren't like the fundamentalists. We're cooler, loosey goosey. However, in defining themselves not as the fundamentalists, they still maintained a lot of that, and now most people would consider conservative evangelicals to be fundamentalists in many ways. And so within evangelicalism is a very broad umbrella. So evangelicals aren't fundamentalists, but some evangelicals are fundamentalists. And so there is some overlap between the two terms.
Now, are there still fundamentalists who are not evangelicals?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So
So
this is a Venn diagram that is not a small circle inside a big circle. It is a small circle overlapping with a big circle.
yes. And now today, hardline Catholics or like trad cats will get called Catholic fundamentalists. They're not fundamentalists in the typical terms, but that's basically because fundamentalism, as the way we use it, has morphed to describe the following. And it's like a strict ideological adherence to a specific set of rigid interpretations of texts or doctrine. They're typically associated with being very hardline, very like facts don't care about your feelings, or in this case, the tradition and the Bible don't care about your feelings. These are the rules, and we are sticking to them. It's typically associated, like I said, with conservative Protestantism, but has morphed to include a wide variety of other sorts of things that aren't necessarily within American Protestantism. Specifically, if you look at how it's used to describe hardline Orthodox or like the Orthobros online or hardline Catholics, they're often called fundamentalist Catholics or fundamentalist Orthodox or something like that. Another association with fundamentalism is an extremely high certainty. So, extreme levels of high certainty where they know what the truth is and they feel like it is their religious obligation and duty to enforce that truth. And the sort of goal of Christianity within fundamentalist ideologies is to learn all the right things, know all the right things, perfectly understand the doctrine, which has all the necessary tools for you to understand, and get the most accurate, true Christianity. Yeah.
See, I wouldn't tell you I grew up fundamentalist, and I don't think I did, certainly not in my family, but I would describe my Christian elementary school very much like what you just said. It was interdenominational, but it still seemed like the goal was we are going to get you to assent to the most correct things possible and also make sure no one ever gets anything wrong about those most correct things as we define them. And there is one way to read the Bible, and it is this way. That doesn't seem different from my school. It was Texas, so it was mostly Southern Baptist. Like interdenominational really just meant what side of town is your Southern Baptist church on.
Yeah.
Um, but
Interdenominational is Baptist, independent fundamental Baptist, and Baptist.
pretty
Just
much. And
yeah, which type
non-denominational
of Baptist
churches,
are you?
yes, non-denominational churches, which were self-Baptist,
Yes.
um, which is the kind I went to. But yeah, I would not have told you as a kid, oh yeah, we're fundamentalists. But what you described does not sound very different from my Christian
Yeah.
elementary school.
And you probably didn't technically grow up fundamentalist, but the way that people use the term and the way that we're going to use it for this podcast, it would you would be considered within that camp. And another key aspect of fundamentalism is a very high expectation of conformity and conformity to a narrow set of ideals.
Which we autistics are famously excellent at.
Yes.
No. Um,
It really
yes.
depends. We
Yes,
can be.
we either extremely high conforming or extremely incapable of conforming to this thing.
Exactly. And that is what we're going to talk about. So, autism and fundamentalism. I got so many questions about this. And there are basically two separate intuitions that you get from autistic people. Either they say, I don't see how any autistic person could be fundamentalist, or they say, fundamentalism is basically just autism all the way down. And those are the sort of two camps you get. And so you get autistic people who think that there is no way that any autistic person could do this. And then there are the autistic people, often autistic people who were raised in those denominations, who are like, the reason that fundamentalists don't realize they're autistic is the same reason fish don't realize they're in water. It's everywhere. Like, autism is baked within the system. And yeah, so those are the intuitions. And the reality is, both intuitions are actually correct, but they're correct in different ways. So, a really common feature in autistic testimonials that they tell me is they often describe themselves as having a phase. And the phase is one of the following. So they'll say, I had a fundamentalist phase. Usually it's in their teens or early 20s where they get really into Christianity and they're like, how do I take this seriously? And who do they go to? The people who read the Bible most literally, who have all the right answers, who do all the things correctly, who know they're right, who have high degrees of certainty, and they're attracted to that. And so they'll often go through a very literalist, fundamentalist phase as a teenager. Often they will say, I went through a hyper Calvinist phase in college. Like, hyper Calvinism is extremely common for autistic people, and the numbers of Protestant raised autistics who go through a hyper Calvinist phase is just insane. Now, if you're not Protestant, if you're Catholic, you usually don't go through a Calvinist phase. You go through like an Aquinas phase or some other church father. Or if you're Orthodox, you will go through a specific hardline Orthodox, extremely systematic, extremely verbose, with very specifically laid out ideas. You'll go through a that person phase. um, and another really common thing is autistic people going through an extremely aggressive apologetics phase. So where they get extremely into apologetics, extremely into wanting to know the right answers, needing to know the right answers, and getting through that. And I say, so the reason I say both of these intuitions are right is because there is a lot of autism in these spaces, and autistic people are inherently attracted to a lot of the aspects of these places. However, when I say it's a phase, it doesn't always last for very long. Sometimes these phases are like 2 to 3 years. Sometimes they're like 5 to 10 years. But usually they're over by the time I talk to them or by the time they talk to me. And we'll talk about why that is. But going through a fundamentalist phase, extremely common. So did you go through any of those phases, Alyssa?
I don't think I knew I was in the apologetics phase when I was in it necessarily, but I definitely was in retrospect. My high school, or not my high school, my youth group, and most of the youth groups in my town, they had like two tiers of summer camp in the summer. There's the summer camp that you're supposed to invite your unsaved friends to, and then there's super summer. Do you know what super summer is?
I don't know, but based on your description, it sounds like I think I can derive the implications.
Super summer, like I was in Texas, so I don't know if it was in other places, but for me, it was in Texas. It took place on a college campus, and you were not supposed to send your whole youth group. You were only supposed to send your youth leaders, like the kids in the youth group who were serious. Um, and I would get sent to Super Summer. Now, Super Summer, different from the regular summer camps, which were more evangelistic. They were more like, hey, we're going to play a lot of games and we're going to have a lot of like small group time where we just explain the very basics of who is Jesus and what does it mean to become a Christian in Southern Baptist terms usually. Super Summer was you bunk with someone you don't know from another church on purpose, and you have to wake up very early for devotionals, and after breakfast you then go to a worship service with kids your age, and after that you have a small group discussion about that worship service. And then there's another worship service, and then another small group discussion about that worship service. There's an annoying break in the middle where they make you play kickball. And then back to more worship services and small group discussions about the worship services for 5 or 6 days. That was the camp that I went to and was much less miserable at than the evangelistic camp, which had a lot more sports and a lot more altar calls, neither of which I was comfortable with. The other thing that I remember about those camps is the dress, because it was Texas and it's hot in the summer, but I was tall and gangly, and there were not shorts in the early 2000s that fit my body that conformed to the dress code for Super Summer. So I would be doing this mostly outdoors summer camp in jeans in 102 degrees because there was not a way I could figure out to follow the dress code. Um, I could see that other people were breaking the dress code and getting by with it, but I couldn't get my head around breaking a rule on purpose. That's not something I would have done. I'd rather
Awesome.
have a heat stroke, apparently.
Based on your listening to this fine podcast, if I had to ask you to make a guess as to why autistic people often go through an apologetics phase or go through a hyper Calvinist phase, what would you use to predict why that would be?
I'm thinking through why I liked Super Summer so much more, besides just avoiding more of the sports and the altar calls. And I think it was that it was so much more structured and a lot more intellectual engagement than a seeker sensitive visitor friendly service. It was a lot more like, we're going to level with you. We're going to tell you what the Bible actually says. We're going to lay out the actual, there's a lot of Lee Strobel case for Christ type of stuff. It was not,
Hell yeah.
when I say intellectually engaged, I don't mean intellectually rigorous.
Yes.
Um,
Intellectually engaged for a 14-year-old.
Intellectually engaged for a 14-year-old. And that was very appealing. If there could be a system, maybe some charts, if I could
Yep.
have exactly how what I learned in Sunday school, if I just understood it deeply enough, actually did fit with science and actually did fit with history and actually did fit with daily life, if I just understood it enough. That was enormously appealing.
Yep, and that is what most autistic people say when I ask them to basically why did you go through this phase? And the big thing that they often say is I found so much of Christianity and so much of church experience hard to relate to and hard to understand. And a lot of times I felt like it didn't mesh with me and I didn't get it. But then comes along this thing where the only thing that you need to do is just think really hard and do comparative analysis and take all of the finely honed tools that you have been building in your head and use them, but use them on the Bible, basically. And they finally get a way that they can engage with Christianity. And they're like, finally, something. I get it. This makes sense. I'm good at this. Yes. And so, because most of their experience with Christianity is often very alienating and very difficult, when they get to a part that they can engage in, they just dive headfirst right into it. And yeah, that is basically why it happens.
Yeah, I
And
think by the time that a lot of my peers were getting into Lee Strobel, I was already like, nope, I need to go farther back. I'm going to
yes,
read all of C.S. Lewis and by what and where my friends who would say at that age 14, 15, oh, I love C.S. Lewis, they mean Narnia. And I meant The Great Divorce
yeah,
and the Screw Tape Letters and the Pilgrim's Regress. I don't know what 14-year-old gets super into the Pilgrim's Regress, but I did.
yeah, and that's it's really funny that we talk about Lee Strobel because so many of us we're just odd kids, we're just weird, we're often precocious children with very niche interests. Like I was 12 years old and reading long historical texts about the siege of Stalingrad. This is I was not your average youth group kid, and most autistic people fall into this really weird place. And the youth pastors go, what am I going to do with this guy? I remember the case for Christ being good. He'll probably like this. And they hand it to you. Um, it is really funny because that story happens all the time with autistic people. And so you get your sort of first taste of intellectual engagement and your first taste of being able to use your sort of hyper systematizing, extreme analytical autism qualities for something that's Christian. And you also get praise for it by people in your environment, right? Because they don't think, oh, this person is so alienated from the rest of Christian experience that they can only engage with this part, which is why they're going so into it. They think, oh, wow, this person's taking their faith really seriously. Yeah.
So when I was a kid at a Southern Baptist church in the youth group, I developed a reputation for asking questions that my Sunday school teachers could not answer. By that point, we were in segregated by gender Sunday school classes, and I would be frustrated because the boys' class was studying the book of James, and the girls' class was praying for the boys while they studied the book of James. Because we were supposed to be praying for our future husbands who would presumably come out of this youth group or another youth group like it. And I would instead try to ask Bible questions, and my teachers didn't know what to do with them because they were not part of the curriculum. And my pastor nicknamed me Brother Alyssa because asking questions about theology in that way was a boy thing to do. And so I knew that it was off. And I wondered if because I did not have youth pastors giving me these books. I was digging through my dad's library and finding them myself, and my grandmother's library and finding them myself. If I had been a boy in that context, I might have had pastors giving me books, asking me if I was interested in seminary. As a girl, it was like, oh, cute, a girl is doing a boy thing.
Yep. So also extremely common thing to hear from autistic women specifically. And yeah, this is basically why a lot of us go through this phase. And we'll talk about why we tend to exit that phase later on in the podcast. But there is also an anomaly that I found, and I'm gonna see what your intuitions are in this. When you look at autistic people between the ages of 18 to 35, most of them go through a fundamentalist phase. When you get to 35 plus, many of them don't have a fundamentalist phase. They just are fundamentalists. And they have been their whole life and they have continued in it. Now that's not all the autistics over the age of 35, but it gets especially more common as you get older. What would be your guess as to why this is the case?
Between the ages of 18 and 35, people often find their community. They will settle into their job and their location, especially if it's a different location than where they grew up. They might get married, they might have kids. And if their whole community that they built and latched onto as a young adult is fundamentalist, then even if their convictions change, there'd be a really high social cost to allowing your own convictions to change if you were inclined that way. That would be my
Yep.
guess.
So that's one of them. That's one of the answers. One of the other answers is your personality just tends to solidify after the age 28. You just start to crystallize.
Once your frontal lobe is fully
Yes,
developed, there you
yes.
have it.
For especially for autistic people, unless barring a significant life event, the way you are when you're 30 is just how you're going to be for most of the rest of the time. The only exceptions I found are people who get diagnosed after the age of 30, because once you get diagnosed, you then have to rethink your entire life through the lens of
Which
autism.
is exhausting.
Yeah,
I
wildly
was
exhausting.
diagnosed as a 36-year-old, and I
Yeah,
am 37, so I'm only a year into reprocessing the first 36 years of my life.
yeah, not a super fun thing. So that tends to change things. But there is another big factor, and that is internet exposure and how diverse your media diet is. One thing I often ask autistic people is, what sorts of media do you consume? What sorts of books do you read? These things. If you are autistic and you were raised in a sort of conservative evangelical or fundamentalist church, how do you get your hands on intellectual material? You go to the library. You go to the church library, you get recommendations from friends. Who are your friends going to recommend? They're not going to recommend skeptical scholars. They're not going to recommend random dudes who have wildly diverging opinions. They are going to recommend people within your information ecosystem. And you aren't really organically going to bump into people who aren't in your information ecosystem very easily. And especially when people over the age of 45 obviously are still on the internet. However, the internet works in bubbles and it works in clusters. It is not wide open. And the younger you are, the more diverse your internet information diet is going to be. The older you are, the less diverse that information diet is going to be. And so, usually, autistics over the age of 40, especially over the age of 45, who are still fundamentalists, I ask them, what sorts of things do you read? It is all like intercamp literature. And you ask them, have you read anything outside? They're like, no, I don't really care about that stuff. That's not interesting to me. And so there's another effect of, and one of the biggest effects that I found, and again, we'll talk about this a little later, is what causes you to leave is large diversity of complex information. And so older people, just by virtue of how they typically get their media and how they get the books and the intellectual resources that they have access to, typically just have lower diversity of intellectual text. And that's basically it. Now, another thing I'll note about these phases is they are much more common and much longer for males than they are for females. Can you guess why?
Just from my, I have a few guesses. From my experience, I think that I would have been really drawn to being an annoying internet Theo bro if I had been a dude and if I had been a young person and had been encouraged in that direction at a sensitive time. But they're not interested in girls, so I was not at risk of that. And also at that age, the internet wasn't nearly the way it is right now. I would also assume that having kids would have something to do with it. I know that having kids had a lot to do with me being able to get out of a higher control situation because there was a lot I could put up for myself, could put up with for myself that I was not willing to ask my kids to put up with.
Yep. That is, you basically hit the nail on the head there. That is why it is much longer and much stronger in autistic men, is autistic men are encouraged. If you are an autistic man and you are really into apologetics and really into studying the Bible, you get told you're an amazing dude. You are on fire for God. You are taking his word seriously. You are diving in. And when it's a girl, it's like, you should really be a mom. Um,
Like, you should really focus on your heart knowledge. This is all head
yes,
knowledge stuff.
yes, exactly, exactly.
The
And so
scourge of our people.
yes. And so for autistic men in these communities, there are significant social incentives to continue doing what you're doing. And there are career paths. There are like whole lives that you can explore within these fields that women just can't, and that women are also explicitly barred from in many cases. That's not to say women don't have some career paths in it. It's just the career paths open to them are not nearly as wide, not nearly as diverse, and not nearly as interesting as they are for autistic men.
But I would also ask, I said that one thing that enabled me to leave a higher control situation was having kids, that I didn't want to
Yes.
put through that. The men also have kids. And it wasn't just me not wanting to put my kids through that, it was also my husband not wanting to put our
Yes.
kids through that. But
There
there's
is the
still a
gender of your
disparity
kids.
there.
Another factor is the gender of your kids, and
Mhm.
whether you have boys or whether you have boys and girls or whether you only have girls, and how much you're so autistic men who have boys who are in these fundamentalist religions are just like, hell yeah, brother, let's keep going. Whereas when they have girls, they start to go, ooh, is this isn't as great as I would like it to be for the girls. And so you have that effect. But also the when you're in these sorts of situations, the way that mothers are expected to care for their children versus the way that fathers are expected to care for your children. Fathers, now I understand that people might get upset with this characterization. I'm saying this is just how it is within fundamentalist and conservative Christian contexts. Fathers are not expected to bear much of the burden of childcare. They don't really have to care about their kids all that much. Now, do they care about their kids? Sure. But the level of attentiveness and attention to the emotional needs of your children as a father in these spaces is just basically not expected of you. You aren't you don't have to bear that burden. You don't have to really
Yeah.
care about it. Um,
Like, my husband would quickly make enemies, not that they knew that enemies, but just like in his mind, with people who would praise him excessively for doing the same things that I was doing that were like really basic caregiving things if he was doing them in public and he would get it like, "You're an amazing dad." And I am just doing the basics. How low is this
exactly.
bar?
Yes. And so men really aren't expected to really take part in that childcare process nearly as much as women are. And so women typically having that significantly higher burden of responsibility for child rearing and childbearing often has a much more significant effect on them than it does on autistic men. And like you said, a very common thing that autistic women will say to me is for leaving high control religions, or a lot of them have abusive relationships and are go through strings of abusive relationships or aren't with very good partners. A lot of what will get them to leave it is they'll have children and they'll think, I was fine putting up with this with me because I'm bad and deserve it, but my children aren't bad and my children don't deserve it, and so I'm going to leave for them. And yeah, so that is also a very common autistic woman response I found.
Are you familiar with Tia Levings? So Tia Levings, who I have no idea if she's autistic. I'm not projecting that onto her, but she has a book that is called The Well-Trained Wife. And I had to, as I was reading it, keep checking the back flap to make sure it was not published posthumously. Spoiler alert, she lived to write the book. But she talks a lot in that book, about how what enabled her to get out was needing to save her kids from living in the same environment she did. And when you talked about people going through a fundamentalist phase as a young person, maybe thinking, okay, who are the super Christians here? I'm going to go learn from the super Christians. And that is a way to drift toward fundamentalism. She writes in her book about how that was her thought process as a young teenager. And she drifted toward the Bill Gothard people because those were the people in her pretty mainstream Southern Baptist megachurch. The subset of people she drifted toward were the people who really seemed to have it all together. And she got mentored into that and married very young into that. And then you're stuck once you've married into it and then built your whole community around it, barring her needing to get herself and her kids out of physical danger. I'm not sure how she would have gotten out of it.
Yeah, and that is a very common way that autistic people get into fundamentalist religion if they aren't born into it, is they'll be like, I need to take Christianity seriously. And to autistic people, seriously means the most literal, the most strict interpretation. We don't want any of this liberal metaphor stuff. We want the hard truth. And there is a huge thing within autistic people in which they are just across the board, not related to fundamentalism, is they are like, I am willing to put myself through significant amounts of pain, suffering, and danger if it is the right principled thing to do. We often have very poor self preservation instincts and very low expectations for personal comfort. And the sorts of things that we're willing to put up with to be right or to hold to our principles are way more than most people would probably normally put up with, just because that's, I don't know, it's just part of what we are like. And we'll talk about this more probably in the next episode about high demand, high control religion, in which a lot of autistic people just, we don't really care as much about our own safety and being so long as we are holding tight to our principles. And that can lead you to a lot of dangerous places where you do a lot of self-destructive things. Anyway, that is a huge pull for autistic people to get involved in fundamentalist religion. Now, I should say, fundamentalism does not mean conservative. So, I know many autistic fundamentalists who are now autistic conservative Christians. Conservative Christians and fundamentalist Christians, there is overlap. Like, all fundamentalists are conservative Christians, but not all conservative Christians are fundamentalists. And the biggest difference is basically how open you are to other types of information. It's your rigidity, your insistence on being correct, a sort of orientation towards epistemology, and very high levels of certainty. So you could be a conservative Christian without being a fundamentalist. I just want to make that really clear. But yeah, so what draws autistic people towards fundamentalism? This is a great question. Now, if you recall episode 8 of the season 1 of the podcast, or the main podcast where I talk about autistic Christianity, I list a whole bunch of tendencies towards and tendencies away from. Now, I'll just remind you, dear listeners, of some of those tendencies. A tendency towards systematizing, a tendency towards intellectualization, a tendency towards literalism, a tendency towards hardlining, and a tendency towards simplicity, and a tendency away from emotionalism. Now, if you look at all those tendencies towards and away, you can probably see, oh, that's why autistic people would want to do fundamentalism, because when you look at fundamentalism, it is extremely systematic. Now, a lot of people will attack it and say, this is stupid and it doesn't make sense. But I want to be very clear. It is internally sound. If you accept the sort of the core propositions of fundamentalism, if you accept that the Bible is the complete, inerrant, literal truth of God, and all things God wanted to communicate to us are found therein, or the Catholic Church has the exact correct magisterial teaching of God, and all the things taught by the Catholic Church are the correct things, and therein contains all knowledge relevant to God. If you accept those as fundamental propositions, fundamentalism is extremely systematic and extremely rigorous. And the way they do Bible study is systematic engagement with the text and systematic theology, where they are going through and they are mapping, this sentence says this applies to this thing over here, these other sentences say this. They will make graphs, they will make charts, they will take every little part of the Bible and they will create infographics for it. They will create handy mnemonic devices and things like that to get you to understand, this is the plain text, this is the way you read it. It is hyper systematized. And a lot of people don't quite get it because they don't agree with the fundamental underlying propositions. But if you can accept those propositions, and if you believe those propositions to be true, it is very systematic and very rigorous. Intellectualization. So again, people go, fundamentalists believe stupid things. And you can still believe that they believe stupid things. However, if you accept their framing of the world, if you accept their worldview, and if you believe that fundamentally they have the correct framing, they're incredibly intellectually rigorous. They're not intellectually rigorous in the way that other people would consider critical historical Bible scholarship intellectually rigorous. But if you want to know languages, if you want to find guys who really know Hebrew or really know Greek, fundamentalist Christian universities are bang on with it. Like they know their stuff. I have spoken to many autistic fundamentalists. They're incredibly intellectual. and they're incredibly intellectualized. So long as you accept the fundamental underlying propositions, everything else just makes sense. The next tendency for literalism, autistic people tend to be very literal creatures, and fundamentalism is just like literalism incarnate. It's just like, I read the text, it says A, I do A, even if it sucks for me. I don't really care. Because the text is right, the text is the word of God, and I'm going to follow that. And
If I had any kind of intuition against it, that's my heart, and the heart is deceitful above all things.
that's in the Bible.
That's in the Bible.
Yeah. And so like, is Genesis 1 and 2 a metaphor? No, it's not a metaphor. There's no symbolism in there. It's about a talking snake and God creating the world in 7 days. You idiot. Haven't you read it? Go back to the Hebrew. These days aren't long periods. These days are literal days. Come on. It's what the text says, and there's a deep comfort in being an autistic person and being like, this is your answer key. Just look at your answer key, and the answer key is the Bible, and the answer key is the biblical text. That is extremely appealing to us. We love a good answer key. We love a good, there is no uncertainty here. There is direct certainty, and your ability to find that certainty is based on your ability to properly read the text. And if you have uncertainty, it's because you haven't properly read the text enough. And this is where you get hyper Calvinism. And this is where guys will be like, I had a huge James White phase because they're like, why should I believe Calvinism? And they go, consult the book. Here are all the verses that point to this. And if a verse says something that appears to say something different, you need to consult these verses. And since those verses can't contradict, these verses must take priority, and you're just misreading the other ones. And so the correct way to interpret the gospel, the correct way to interpret the message of the Bible is through this incredibly rigorous systematic reading. Text is best used to interpret other text, and the whole Bible is the whole word of God and cannot contradict itself. It is without error. This is the way to read it. Extremely autistic way of thinking through and processing things, especially for young autistics. Autistic people have a tendency to hardline. We have a tendency to read a text and take it to its logical extent and to its most logical conclusion, and to not nuance things and to not say, it's complicated. We tend to go, okay, the Bible said it. I believe that settles it. And
As
it's
the
really,
bumper sticker says.
yes. And it's really funny because sometimes this autistic tendency leads you towards fundamentalism, and sometimes this autistic tendency leads you to being a communist. And the way it breaks down is basically whichever parts of the Bible you believe really said it first. Like, you read James chapter 5, now listen, you rich, weep and wail for the misery that is coming for you.
Now welcome to the
Yes.
Socialist Party.
Yes, and they're like, hell yeah, I should be a socialist. Or they will read a lot of the early church fathers and just be like, yeah, this makes sense. I should become a socialist now. And
Should hold
sometimes,
all things in common
yes,
and
yeah,
live in community in that way.
it's there in Acts 2. This is the blueprint for how Christians should be living, so let's just do it. And so you will have that. You'll get a lot of Christian anarchists who are like, the Bible doesn't say anything about government, or that we should believe that government is good. There is an enormous amount of skepticism about kings and leaders in the Hebrew Bible. And when Paul says to obey and accept authority, he's not saying that authority is good or we should structure our lives, but that these are things that we just have to deal with and we have to accept. And yeah, sure, America is the will of God, and the will of God is to punish us for our insolence. And so there are just like all these sorts of extremely hardline interpretations of the text. And autistic people love that. And that is everywhere within fundamentalism. You go to any fundamentalist sermon, you go to any fundamentalist apologist, it is hardline. Now, simplicity, another really big one. Is there deep complexity within fundamentalist thinking? I would argue no, and that's one of the draws. It is not deeply complex. It is not deeply nuanced. It is, we have the answers. These are the answers. The Bible said it. I believe that settles it. You go to Answers in Genesis, for example, massive fundamentalist organization, huge. They like built the ark, and
Yeah, those are like the Ken Ham people,
yeah,
right?
the Ken
The
Ham
with
people.
the Creation Museum. Okay.
Yes,
Yes.
whenever I talk to Australian autistics, I'm like, your proudest export, Ken Ham. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
my when I was still in a Christian school as a kid, seventh grade was my last year there, but the seventh grade Bible teacher and the seventh grade science teacher were the same person. And it was a lot, and the classes were indistinguishable from each other because it was mostly a creationist apologist class. And I could get a very good grade in it because I can memorize those things and I can say them back for the test. And that is how you are a good Christian who gets a good grade.
yes. And I've met a lot of young Earth creationist autistics. And I've met a lot of young Earth creationist autistics because there is basically this just tendency to be like, look, there is no need for complexity here. There is no need for nuance. The Bible says this. This is just what it is on the label. And look, well, don't you think about the evidence for evolution? They're like, turn with me to Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's like, okay,
I got the arts autism. I did not get the math and science autism.
yeah,
And so in college, I went to a Christian college. I don't need to be secretive about that. I went to Wheaton, and for better
many
or
such
worse,
cases.
depending on, yes, for better or worse, depending on the day, I went to Wheaton College, and I decided I would do better getting all my science credits done at one time over the summer rather than spreading them out because I knew I didn't do dividing my attention into multiple things. I did not yet know I was autistic. Um, and so they had this program where you could go spend the summer in the Black Hills of South Dakota at a satellite campus and get all your gen ed sciences at once. It was environmental science and astronomy and geology. And the basic end project for every one of these classes was please write a paper about why science is allowed to be real at the same time as God is allowed to exist. And it was because the point of those gen ed classes seemed to be can we start the deprogramming of our students who came in so fundamentalist that they don't think science is real?
Yeah, and
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 some of the students really struggled with this,
yeah.
would spend a lot of time arguing with the teachers. I struggled in the classes because I'm not good at science. They struggled in the class, but I could write this essay. This was not a problem. They struggled with the classes because they could not, with integrity at that time, write that essay.
Yep. And
Mhm.
so a huge factor I see in a lot of autistic deconversion, it was a big factor in mine, is learning that evolution is probably true and just realizing that there's actually really good evidence for it. And because we are very literal, because we're very hardline, and we are used to this incredibly rigorous, systematic way of thinking, all of a sudden, evolution's true. It's like, okay, everything in Christianity is wrong and it's false. Cool. Moving on.
Are
And
you
like,
familiar with merit? Yeah.
yeah, that wasn't my experience, right? I didn't immediately deconvert, but that was the
Mhm.
beginning of the
Mhm.
like 9 month process of deconversion for me, was realizing evolution was actually true. And like that wrecks autistic people, especially young autistic men in the sciences. So if you're a young autistic man and you work in the sciences, the chances that you will get absolutely like smacked down by evolutionary science in your early semester and then lose your faith because of it is really high. And it's really high because we have these ever systematic, everything's linked, everything's connected, everything's hard, everything's crystallized. We're very literal, we're very hardline, and then we realize, oh, this is not literally true in the plain sense reading of the text. I guess all of Christianity is false then, and they walk away. Um, and it's just like a matter of, is this true or is this not true? Oh, this is not true. See ya, and
Mhm.
that's about it. um, it's wild.
Have you encountered the work of Meredith Ann Miller?
Almost certainly, that name sounds very familiar. However, I couldn't name it off the top of my head.
She is a pastor of a small church in California, but she did some work with the Fuller, I want to say the Fuller Youth Institute, about researching like what makes faith stick for young people.
Oh, yes, I have read this.
Okay, she did some work with that, but she herself is not primarily a researcher. She's a children's pastor. And now she pastors adults as well, but at the time she was a children's pastor. And she has a book called Woven. I think the subtitle is like Nurturing a Faith Your Child Doesn't Have to Heal From or Recover From, or something like that. And her work has been really helpful to me. And she asserts that one of our trouble, she's not talking specifically about neurodivergent kids, but I think it applies, is that if we approach discipling people, especially young people, with the guiding metaphor of we are building a strong foundation and then a wall, what happens when that kid does learn that evolution might be true if literal creationism was part of their foundation? And it's that the whole thing starts to crumble. She advocates changing the metaphor to one of a spider web where it's built to break and built to be rewoven again, which I is a change I appreciated in my head. Because with my own kids, I know what I've needed to explain to their pastors is that for them, an unexplained change of plans is the same as a broken promise, which is the same as a lie, which is the same as a betrayal. And so it's very quick if a pastor does something that is unexpected and unexplained to them to go, oh, this is the person who's teaching me about God. What else are they lying to me about?
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Extremely common. I use a similar metaphor about like watchmaking, how autistic people build these like theological pocket watches, like with tightly wound and precise gears and everything
Mhm.
like that. And everything needs to work with every other piece of thing. And if one grain of sand gets in one part of the mechanism, it breaks and it stops. And we should not be encouraging people to build. If you want to build a Christianity that they can live with, you don't need a pocket watch. You need ballistics gel, basically. You need something that can absorb bullets and that can subsume the bullet within it once it gets fired at it and properly imbue all these things and, if necessary, expel it. But, like, this, if you build a system so precise that if one out of the 10,000 parts fails, everything breaks down, like, you've made a mistake. And that is a huge thing that happens with fundamentalism is they build these incredibly systematic, incredibly rigorous things built on these fundamental assumptions. And if these fundamentalist assumptions get, even if you drop the certainty on one of them by even 2%, that is massive, and it has cascading effects across the entire system, and it causes huge amounts of problems. And another big factor is fundamentalists tend not to be super emotional. They tend not to be very Jesus is my boyfriend. It's no, read the text, learn the text, get your answers. Once you have your answers, you're good. If you go to James White and watch his YouTube channel, which I have done many times and I keep up with him because so many autistic people also keep up with him and I need to be
Taking one
conversant
for
in
the
James
team.
White.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Taking one for the team.
Yeah, incurring brain rot by James White YouTube. Many such cases, unfortunately. Not just James White. I'm in all the brain rot places just so I can understand what autistic people say. It's very common to just be like, look, there isn't an emotional component to this. So this is about being right. And autistic people love being right. And they love the opportunity to be right. And so this is basically what it comes down to. So another question I get is, how common is this? And the answer is, I don't know. It is extremely hard to get good numbers on this. How many autistic people report going through a fundamentalist phase? If they are ex-Christian, like 95%. So if they have left the Christian faith, most of them report going through this phase, and that is the last phase of Christianity they are in. Basically,
Oh, so they didn't go super Christian to halfway lukewarm Christian to out. They went super Christian to burned out. Like there was
Yes.
not a
Yep.
gradual fading away.
And sometimes they will take a step into progressive Christianity, and then they step in and they're like, what's even the point of this? And then they step out. And so sometimes there's like a gradual step out, but usually it's I honestly I was just coping at that point. And then they leave. So it's 95% of ex-Christians go through this, and it's usually the last phase of Christianity that they were like seriously in for a prolonged period of time.
Which I feel like is so different from the popular stereotype of people who deconvert.
Yes.
Um, Whereas you had there, I forget which episode you began with a complete jump scare of an audio about people who deconvert weren't really Christians in the first place.
Yes.
Um, I was like, am I listening to the right podcast? I was. It was a jump scare. Um, but it was the popular stereotype is, oh, it was too hard for them. They weren't really serious about it.
Yeah.
But you were saying that your research shows, oh no, they were the ones who were the most committed, the
Yes.
most serious, the most sold out,
Absolutely.
who are more likely to totally deconvert.
Yes. They 100% super sold, fully in. It's that autism light switch effect, right? You're either fully in or you're fully out, and there's no in between. You're either
There's no
sprinting
dimmer
or you're
switch.
walking. Yeah, it's a binary on off. It's not a dimmer. There is ironically no spectrum on the autism spectrum. It's you're either fully in or you're fully out. And it's extremely common for ex-Christian autistics to have gone through this phase. For currently practicing autistic Christians, it's 80% of us go through one of these phases. And like a serious phase, it is usually a very large component of our lives. Now, there's also a lot of data that I can't get very well on this because fundamentalist religions and fundamentalist expressions of Christianity are very adverse to mental health diagnoses and exploring mental health. And they're like autism, more like nautism or something.
Oh no. Oh no,
They're
that's the
like,
worst thing I've heard. I thought you were about to say something either about this is a manifestation of your sin or this is demon possession, and
oh,
instead you
it is
said
that.
nautism.
No, so there is a extreme resistance to mental health and cognitive development disorder identification in these spaces. Usually I talk to people after they've left those spaces or after they've gone through burnout and they go to a therapist and the therapist is like, dude, you are like a level 4,000 autist. What is wrong with you? I know what's wrong with you. You have Asperger's. And you need to understand this about yourself. And then they're like, whoa, that's weird. And then they find me and then they talk to me. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's, yep, 100% what's going on here. And so usually it's after they have a serious crisis that they find me. And usually when I talk to them, they go, brother, you have no idea how many of us there are back in my old church. Like how common it is. Now, of course, I can't talk to those people because those people don't recognize they're autistic or think that autism is a fake made up thing, like made by the woke liberal media to trans our kids or whatever. That's a joke,
No,
by the way. It's a joke, actually. That's 50% joke. um,
it's not as much of a joke as I would like it to be.
yes, yes. I wish that was more of a joke.
It's a
However,
truth in comedy joke.
yes, yeah. And so you see stuff like that. And so I get the impression from surveying people who left and their reports of people who are still in that it is fairly common within those circles, but I can't get hard numbers on those places because they don't talk to me and they don't want to talk to me. And so I can only go off the reports of people who left those circles and are like, yeah, this is 2 out of every 5 of us in that church. So it's okay, cool. Yep, makes sense. Intuitively, that tracks. And based on the number of people I talk to who leave and who say similar things, I'm pretty sure it makes sense. And yeah, how common is it? I don't know, but I'm going to say very. I can't put an exact number on it, the number of us who go through a phase, it's about 4 out of every 5 of us report that we had one of these phases that lasted at least 2 years. The number who leave, it's 95%. There are like 5% who didn't. And again, they are super sold. They are into it. And
By that
like,
point, are they like the ones who stay? Are they like pastors or priests or something where their livelihood depends upon them staying?
so sometimes it is. Often there are autistic men who are very well connected in these circles and who, quite frankly, have a pretty good time, you know? Because what do you
Gender
do?
role enjoyers.
Gender role enjoyers. Exactly. So you're in a fundamentalist Bible study. What do? You get together with the boys and you talk about systematic theology and you get to info dump on them. What
There
do
are
you
so
do?
many local groups where I am. I don't know how many, but a non-zero number of groups where it's men and they're getting together to talk systematic theology over pipes and pints. And then they
Yes.
probably have a pithy name about it and think that they are the new Inklings. That is what they think. And I'm not allowed in these groups, but I could see myself having been super drawn into them if I had been a young man. And I would like to be a fly on the wall and wonder how many of you are one of us.
I can give you answers to that because, as many listeners of this podcast can tell, and as some non-listeners of this podcast are often disappointed to learn, I'm in fact a man. um, it's really funny. This is just an anecdote, but apparently on Twitter and Blue Sky, I come across as an autistic woman, and
Is that because your avatar is of Simone Weil?
so that's one factor. But also, I post like a lot about autistic women because autistic women ask me lots of questions. And so I answer them, and I answer them over Twitter and stuff publicly because I figure if one person's asking me this, a whole bunch of other people are probably curious and just not going to ask me, but would like to know. And so I just posted on Twitter, and it just so happens a lot of the people with the most numbers of questions are autistic women, and so they also ask me a lot. And also, I find autistic radfems very funny, and so I post lots of autistic radfem jokes. And so I sometimes do an interview with an autistic woman, and she's like visibly disappointed when she sees that I'm a man.
Oh
It's
no.
very funny, and she's like, "I swore you were a woman." I thought that you were Amy. And I was like,
No.
I am John. Sorry. Sorry to disappoint you. This is not a female solidarity empowerment moment. This is a you're talking to an autistic guy.
This
Anyway,
is an autistic solidarity empowered
yes.
moment.
Yes. So I've been to a lot of these groups. These groups are, I would say, 50% autistic. I attended them because I was interested in them when I was young, and now I attend them as a research opportunity. But yes, very common. And so if you are an autistic man in these situations, a lot of times it's great. It's good. You get to hang out with the boys and do systematic theology, and you are praised for doing it better than everyone else because you are the most systematic, most hardline dude in the planet because you're autistic.
You maybe become a college professor at this thing or
Yes.
a priest at this thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And many autistic conservative fundamentalists end up at conservative fundamentalist universities because who's the guy who's going to go teach Hebrew at Moody Bible Institute? The autistic guy who took Hebrew at Moody Bible Institute and was like, hell yeah, this is amazing. I'm going to keep doing it. The number of so I at one point I just started cold calling conservative Christian universities and being like, I'm doing a research project about professors at conservative universities so that I can interview them about autism because I know they wouldn't know that they're autistic, but I would just talk to them and I would ask them questions about, I'd be like, I'm doing a personality assessment, so can you just fill this out? And it was essentially like my own version of Radzar without saying autism. So I could get their autism scores.
You
um,
secretly gave a bunch of people the rat?
maybe. This is, people are like, you should do this research in an academic setting. I'm like, there is no university
No.
ethics board that would ever approve that method.
No, but also I know a lot of people who I have suspicions about, like maybe you are also neurodivergent, but who wouldn't necessarily know how to have that conversation, but who are super into Myers-Briggs or more likely Enneagram or something else that's like a sort of pseudoscience-y personality test of, oh, if I told you this was an Enneagram test, could I get your RAD score or your CAT
So,
Q?
so I built a questionnaire specifically for this demographic where I'd be like, I'm just doing a personality assessment. And it was basically just, are you autistic? And if they scored high enough on it, I'd be like, cool, can I interview you for this? And so I know there are an enormous amount of autistic men in these positions, or suspected autistic men, I should say. Suspected, speculation. I can't diagnose people. I can just very strongly suspect it based off of essentially sending them the Radzar, but with language stripped out of it, and more specifically tailored to conservative Christians. Anyway, they're everywhere. They're in the trees. And another really big factor is, so these autistic men, they find nice women who are in the church, they marry them, and they have kids. And what is the strongest indication that you're going to have, that you're going to be autistic, is if you have one autistic parent, at least one autistic parent, because autistic fundamentalist women often pair with autistic fundamentalist men, because autistic fundamentalist men tend not to really care a whole lot about the social stuff within Christian fundamentalism. And so, if you're an autistic woman and you see this weird guy who likes to nerd out on Hebrew language or something and doesn't really care too much about all the gender politics and stuff and just treats you like an intellectual equal, it's like, I've hit the jackpot. I talk to a lot of these guys. Some of them, when I talk to them, they'll be like, oh yeah. So when I was doing the interviews, one of the things, they'd be like, yeah, so I have 4 kids. One of them has special needs. I'm like, oh, interesting. What kind of special needs? Oh, he's on the autism spectrum.
There you have it.
Interesting. I wonder how that happened. And I'd
Hmm.
sometimes drop, oh,
Like,
do you know autism has a very strong genetic component to it? You'd be like, what? Oh, I didn't know that. I'm like, yeah. Like, there's a strong family history of it. I have it. Oh, you have it. Yes. I'm gonna just drop that hand grenade and walk away.
yep.
Yeah, it's incredibly common to in these circles. I just don't know how common it is. It is especially common in intellectual circles in these places. Not all fundamentalist churches have intellectual components to it. They often discourage intellectualism, and that's often a very big, like, they discourage questioning, or only questioning within these certain bounds. And if you go outside those bounds, that's a major issue. And they socially punish you for that and things like that. But yeah, that's basically
Do
the
they get
frequency.
I had the experience of when I asked too many questions that were outside of the Sunday school curriculum as a kid, I would get told to have faith like a child. And
Yes.
then I one time made the mistake of pointing out, I think I was probably 13 or 14, to my Sunday school teacher, I am technically a child. This is,
Yes.
I am a child. And she said, not that kind of child.
Yeah.
And so, oh, like knowing real children ask a lot of questions all the
Yes.
time about things that you would rather they not ask questions about because you just need them to put on their shoes. But what part of being childlike and having faith like a child isn't asking 1,000 questions and then asking them again?
Yeah.
I'd never have understood this.
Yeah. No, and so that's, yeah, 100%. Another, so people ask me, like, what are these people like, these autistic fundamentalists? What are they like and how do they function? Generally speaking, they have what I call a low diversity information diet, meaning they are incredibly intellectual and they read a lot of stuff, but only within a very narrow range, usually of approved authors. Or they won't read any of that liberal stuff type of thing. They are extremely into graphs and charts. I joke about Christian graphs and charts autism. If you have been in these spaces like I have and like I was raised in, my dad is a graphs and charts Christian autist. where you want to understand the Bible. Here, let me give you this graph and chart of the book of Revelation that we made. Or, these prophecies in Daniel, let's graph out the exact dates for all of this stuff. And let's draw this out. If you talk to these guys, they love their graphs, they love their charts, they love their infographics, they love visualizing Bible data. They
Yes.
like autism spreadsheets applied to the Bible is what this looks like.
I remember, I'm not sure that the people who gave me these charts and graphs were specifically autists. I remember as like maybe I don't know, sometime in high school, I had there was another church that I had gone to as a little kid that we didn't go to anymore, and I missed it. And so sometimes I would go and visit their youth group because they did actual Bible study instead of just like pizza and Jesus is my boyfriend songs. But the actual Bible study was a mix between, okay, here's your charts and graphs of what happened in the Bible so that you know exactly the dates of all these things and exactly how they all line up with like other historical and archaeological facts we know. But then in the same handwriting and the same method, it would be like, and here is dispensationalism here. So the charts look the same, which sort of makes it seem like this theological theory is on par and part of the same system as me just charting out the timeline of Israel and Judea.
Yes. It is really funny how much of that stuff there is and how much of it is produced by autistic men. So, another fun story, many of these people that I would reach out to and talk to would be like, you should check out my website. I think you'd be interested in learning more about it. And you go to their website, and it is just graphs and charts and spreadsheet data. It is just like raw autism concentrated into 2000s HTML in the best way possible. Like in the way that like even though I'm like I fundamentally disagree with the basic assumptions you're making in this, but like the autist in me is in awe at how hard you've autismed here. Like how much there was going on. Anyway, yeah, charts and graphs. That is one of the things that these guys look like. They basically operate on the assumption everything can be figured out. We have all of the data that we need, and all that's left for us to do is solve for X. And so we just need to solve for X. This is a big math problem that needs to be solved. We have all the tools to do it. Let's just get down and do it. These guys love apologetics. Like, love apologetics. Huge into apologetics. Very into all the arguments. You ask these guys for any arguments for God, they will, across the board, knock it out. You ask them for proof of the flood, they'll have 10,000 things. They will have theories of how the boat could have been, like Noah's Ark could have been constructed, and like the waste disposal management systems that Noah probably had to build into the boat in order to make sure that like disease and pathogen wouldn't carry through, or that, and like how they would get food storage in these places, and what age each of the animals would probably have to have been in order for them to have the food and sanitary requirements in the size that they needed it. It's impressive. I'm just going to say, I don't agree with it. It's cool. Like it's like
I think what
this is so fun. Like I read it like Star Trek lore stuff when like a guy is super into Star Trek and just takes all the information in Star Trek canon to figure out how this would all have actually worked. That's how I see it. But I don't know. I think it's cool. Um,
I do think a like slightly more than my peers diversity of information diet was probably what kept me from falling fully into that. This part of Revelation means this
yes.
in a way that was really just Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins.
Yeah.
And it's because I have an uncle who I like a lot, who is a scholar, a biblical scholar and theologian focused on the book of Revelation. And so we had his books on our shelf too, and they didn't agree. And I knew I liked him,
Mm,
which meant that maybe there was more than one possible answer to this
yes.
because I trusted my uncle.
Yes. And that is basically what usually either brings autistic people out or what stops them from going in fully is basically increased information diet. That is, so when I ask people, why did you leave your hyper Calvinist phase? Why did you leave this? And they're basically like, I read other things and I realized there was a lot more uncertainty. And basically, whatever sort of drops their level of certainty, or they read other people and go, oh, these are actually reasonable arguments. Maybe my baseline fundamental assumptions about how this works might be off. Maybe my intuitions are actually a little bit skewed here. And that's usually what leads them to leaving. Now, there are a few other factors. The biggest one, like I said, is just reading more and reading widely. So, autistic people, especially younger autistic people, so there's a thing called a dopamine treadmill where you basically just read something and then you get your autism hyperfixation dopamine hit from it and you're like, hell yeah, this is great, I love this. And then you keep going and then you're just reading more of the same stuff and it's not hitting the same and you're like, I already know this information, I need more information.
The answer must be to read more,
Yes.
in my personal opinion,
Yes.
right?
And they
Read
go,
more things.
yeah, and so they often go, I need to read more. And then they exhaust all the reading within their little niche and go, okay, I still want to learn more. I still want to gather more information. I'm just going to start reading outside my niche. And then they start reading outside their niche and they go, oh, these people are actually making good points that I hadn't previously thought about. What usually knocks autistic people out of their apologetics phase is they go from consuming every bit of apologetics they can to starting to read primary academic sources that are referenced by apologetics. And once they start reading the primary academic sources, they go, ooh, okay, this is more complicated than I had initially thought. And so they'll read apologetics and they'll be like, this is great. But again, I want the harder stuff. I want it more.
I do think, as you, I think, told me when I did my interview with you for your data, that I have a tendency toward negative polarization.
Yes.
And so I didn't have a big sudden deconstruction. This was like a slow rolling ship of Theseus situation, not a blow everything up at once situation. And one of the pieces that got dismantled was I did some freelance proofreading for a Christian publisher. And my job was not to address anything about the text. I was looking for typos. That was my job. I was looking for typos, looking for broken links in the audio or in the ebook. That was all I was doing. In many cases, these books were already in print. I was just fixing the links in the ebooks. And that included actually reading the bibliography and in the back and the acknowledgments in the back and realizing that the acknowledgments and the bibliography were the same because it was just a few friends citing each other at this Christian publishing house. I was like, oh, wait a second. This is just a conversation between a bunch of friends, and they are making it everyone's problem. And especially because these are not books I would have picked up on my own. They were like books written for pastors. And at this publishing house, that would not include me because I am a woman. So they are not assuming that any women are reading these books, much less reading the bibliography. I don't think they're meaning to be sneaky. They just do not have, but it means that's where they are going to say the quiet parts out loud. And I was like, oh, I wonder what their source is for this. And then I would turn back and look at their sources and realize, oh, his source is himself, or his source is his friend. I know it's his friend because in the acknowledgments, this is his friend. And got me out of it got me looking at these sources in Christian nonfiction books before I read the book to make sure that wasn't the case before wasting my time.
Yep. No, that's completely it. Other things that tend to, so the biggest one is information diet. Like I said, once it expands, either you need the next dopamine hit, so you start reading outside of your niche because you've already expended everything inside your current niche, and you just start to realize other people make good points. The other really big one is ideological issues and moral intuitions not interlocking. Really big thing that happens. Autistic people have meet other autistic people, and sometimes those other autistic people are gay. And sometimes they're not even autistic. They just meet another gay person and they go, "You are ontologically evil and fundamentally sexually disordered." But they're like, "But I will bring you to Christ because that is my duty as a Christian." And then they start talking to them and they realize actually this is just a person. Um, and this is, oops, guess I was wrong. Guess I was
Oh
wrong
no.
about my fundamental assumptions about the inherent ontological evilness of gay people. And that is a very big thing that I'll hear is they what brought you out of this phase. They're like, I met a gay person. Like I became friends with a gay person. Often it's another autistic person, and they relate so deeply to this person. And they're like, you are one of the first people that I feel I can talk to, and you get me. And in a world full of people you can't comprehend, the only person that you can comprehend is a gay man, does some things to your brain.
This is the Alyssa story of my
Yes.
freshman year of college. Yes.
Yeah, and so that genuinely happens a lot, and they start going, maybe I misjudge things. And so usually they will not all of a sudden turn progressive. They will usually just become more nuanced and more compassionate and be like, okay, my church is wrong about this. They'll usually say being gay is still a sin. They'll still hold to a conservative ethic, but they'll be like, but we were absolutely wrong about like AIDS being punishment from God to destroy gay people. This was, in fact, a tragedy, and it was not punishment from God. It was just bad. And things like that. Other big thing that get mentioned fundamentalist uh, religion, especially in the English speaking world, is very closely tied to conservative politics. And then you start having a falling out with conservative politics or aspects of conservative politics. This was especially common with the rise of Donald Trump. A lot of autistic people were like, "What the hell?" That's
Yeah, the
they.
feeling of having the people who taught me a bunch of purity culture stuff in youth
Yes,
group, then turning around and becoming adamant Trump supporters was extremely jarring. I was like,
yes.
wait, did you change your mind or did you never mean it? Which
Yep.
one is it?
So extremely common.
And
Also,
if you never meant it, what else did you not mean?
yep.
What else were you lying to me about?
Reactions to racism and things like that. So you go to college, you meet a lot of friends from different races, you leave your hometown, you join the army is another common one, or you join the military, and all of a sudden you're thrown in with a bunch of Mexicans, a bunch of black guys, a bunch of Asians, and you're like, these people become your brothers, right? And you build these really strong emotional bonds with them. And often they're more Christian than the white people. They are more Christian and closer to you Christian than the white people, but they will often have very different racial politics than the ones that you were raised with. And this usually causes them to go, oh, we were wrong about this, and open their mind and become more expansive. And because fundamentalist religion is often closely tied to conservative politics, this causes a rift for them, and it is in that rift that they will typically leave that phase. Those people tend not to deconvert; they just tend to become conservative Christians. Like they just go from fundamentalist to conservative, and so fundamentally they're just more reasonable, more open to interpretation, more open to correction, more just okay, I don't have all the answers, and this there's actually a lot of complexity here. And it's fine that there's a lot of complexity and a lot of difficulty. They'll still be like theologically conservative. They might be more open to other things, but yeah, those are some of the big triggers specifically for men. For women, a really big one is sexism. Huge one is sexism and restrictions, seeing their friends, their female friends, get into abusive relationships, and the church either covering it up, doing nothing about it, um, encouraging their women friends to go back to their abusive husbands and forgive their abusive husbands, where they just get abused again. And like the cycle continues because spousal abuse is not like a single contained incident, it is a large pattern. And a lot of these fundamentalist churches do not believe in divorce, they do not believe in anything like that. It's always you must reconcile with your spouse. And so, like, autistic women, sexism and sex based discrimination becomes a very big thing for them. And the church's failure to respond to sexism and sex based discrimination is like, it's massive. It is a huge factor for autistic women. Usually, again, it does not lead them to fully deconstruct. It leads them usually to just a more egalitarian form of evangelicalism. And that's basically it. They'll move from being complementarians and they'll go, complementarianism doesn't work for women, it works for men. And I care about women and my women friends. And it, sorry, doesn't work, leads to abuse, leads to women getting abused. One autistic woman I talked to talked about how what got her out of her hyper Calvinist phase and her extremely conservative fundamentalist phase was she went to dinner with her boyfriends at her boyfriend's family's house, and she saw how her boyfriend, his brothers, and his dad were treating their mom. And their mom, she had a theology degree, and that's how they met the dad. The dad is a fairly famous pastor within this sort of gospel coalition ecosystem. I'll say that. And this woman was basically talking about how they were denigrating their mother and making fun of her because she was like, I have a theology degree. And they're like, yeah, from this university. That's not a real university type of thing. And
Oh
it
no.
was just intense sexism. And she was like, don't you have a problem with this? And they were like, no, it's my mom. She doesn't have a real theology degree. Women don't do theology. And they're like, but I'm a woman and I do theology. And then later on, that person told this autistic woman, actually, you don't do theology. You are a woman. You don't do that. Anyway, luckily she broke up with them. But unfortunately, many such cases of this
Yeah.
type of thing, and just autistic women's response to sexism in these spaces is significantly a much bigger story and a much bigger component than it is for autistic men. And that is basically just because autistic women actually have to confront the cold, hard reality of it, whereas autistic men can be shielded from it if they would like to be. And gender complementarianism and reaction to gender complementarianism is often a very big thing, especially for autistic women who decide to leave these sort of things.
So specifically when I did some freelance proofreading, it was for some like backlist titles for the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood.
A
And I
classic
had not,
ecumenical church council.
oh yes, a real one.
Yes.
And I hadn't really had a lot of opinions about it before. I had moved from a Southern Baptist-ish upbringing into more of a liturgical church where women could do things, um, could lead prayers, and occasionally, very occasionally, preach a sermon. Not celebrate Eucharist, but do some other things. And at the time, that was the most inclusive place I'd ever been. And so for me, it was like, oh, look, I have found a less sexist place. We're good now. And just didn't really think any more about the gender roles. By the time I was doing this proofreading, I was married, and my husband and I did not really make decisions according to gender roles. We made decisions according to what we were each good at and
Perhaps
capable of
a
doing.
perhaps a default meritocratic egalitarianism.
Perhaps. Um,
Perhaps the
but
the main way through which autistic people
mhm,
view gender roles as an autistic woman married to an
mhm.
autistic man.
Yes, we were an undiagnosed autistic woman married to an undiagnosed, probably autistic man. We so we just did what made sense. And then I got this freelance job proofreading all these books for the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And there's one book, I could find the title probably, but I don't have it at my fingertips, that asked about it was for pastors. It asked, what about cases where, what would submission look like in cases where the man is asking the woman to violate her conscience, in which the husband is asking the wife to violate her conscience. And in the footnote that I proofreaded, it said that what many people refer to as a woman's conscience is actually a manifestation of her own sinful nature. And so that is not an exception that we should make. And I was like, oh, all of this stuff that is for a more general audience is so much softer, but underneath it, this is what you're really saying. And you're only going to put that part in print in the footnote in a book that is only for pastors. And I was like, oh, I have gone from not thinking much about this at all to being extremely against this very quickly. This is bad. This is very bad. And this would put women in danger. This would is also just stupid. It seems of a piece with the John Piper idea of what should a woman do if a man asks directions to the highway and she knows and he doesn't. That put her in an awkward position about submission to male authority. If she has information he doesn't have, how should she biblically give him directions to the highway? This is absurd.
Yes.
I find this absurd. And before reading like my John Piper journey was that as a high schooler, a youth pastor who did take me seriously, gave me a copy of Desiring God. And that was really the only overt, here is some Calvinism for you that I ever got. And I was mostly just like pleased that a youth pastor took me seriously and gave me this book. And I think the parts that didn't make sense to me, I thought I must just not be mature enough to understand these yet. And while there's some gender ideology baked into that book, it's not the main topic of the book. And it wasn't until I later read more of his biblical manhood and womanhood ideas about female submission because he visited our campus. And so a lot of his books were just around, you could build card houses with them. And then I realized, oh, again, if he's wrong about this, what else is he wrong about? Maybe he's wrong about his version of Calvinism too. Maybe he's wrong about other things. So that is, but all through that time, I was still staying in a church that was fundamentally complementarian, but I don't think I realized how complementarian it was until there were some abuse cases and some women stepped out of line to blow whistles and saw how the church treated them.
Yeah, unfortunately, many such cases. Not even remotely uncommon. Yeah, so that is a really significant factor for autistic women. That really isn't a big factor for autistic men in a lot of their that's why I left this phase. That being said, sometimes men will mention that, how they don't like how their wives get treated, or sometimes they'll marry autistic women and they'll think, my wife's smart, she should contribute to this, and they will naively go into situations not understanding that there are these enforced gender dynamics and they've just been invisible to them because they're a man, and then all of a sudden having to realize that they're there, and they go, wait, this sucks, why are we doing this? And the wife is, oh, we're allowed to say this sucks? Great, let's go. So that does happen. It's just not nearly as frequent as when it comes to men. Final thing we should probably talk about is the fallout of not being in one of these phases anymore. It varies from person to person. Sometimes they get a pretty clean break from it, where it's just like, all right, this isn't something I do anymore. However, those people are usually young. They are usually independent. They don't have any dependents. They don't care about anything else, or the only dependents they have are their wife and kids who also leave with them. However, for people who are deeply enmeshed in communities, especially priests, pastors, guys whose jobs rely on the church, women who are specifically in church administration roles, etc., the fallout is usually extremely messy and pretty brutal. There are many feelings that happen, feelings of betrayal. You often get cut off from these communities when you leave them. Like, it's not just like you leave, it's you leave and the church shuns you. And so it's not just you left, it's you left and are now a bad person. You are apostate. You have become liberal, or like you have turned to the side of the enemy and now serve the devil. There are lots of things
Mm-hmm.
like that, especially for women, and we'll probably talk about this next episode, but women in the church too movement just got absolutely pilloried when they left. And they left because they were like, the church is not responding to sexual assault correctly. Like, this is serious. We all believe sexual assault is bad, and they get told that they're a Jezebel spirit and need to like conform and come back and to stop talking, and they don't. And so this becomes extremely messy
Mhm.
and
Or
extremely,
sometimes they get told a more subtle, you just need to trust that process.
yes,
And and you just need to keep trusting the process. That process, you should just keep trusting it. And if you stop trusting the process, then you become a tool of Satan.
yes. It's wild. And there's a lot of, again, just trust me, bro, or it'll work out, or we have internal processes for dealing with this. And the internal process is sending the sexually abusive youth pastor to a different church that doesn't know that they're sexually abusive, and they go, what the hell? We should not be doing that. They call up the other church or their friends in the other church to be like, do you know this guy was sexually abusing young girls in the youth group? And then they get attacked for telling this other church and for spreading discontent. And we like, he
Yes,
confessed.
for spreading disunity in the body
Yes.
of Christ.
Yeah, but he confessed, and he
Mhm.
confessed to us, and he's gone through our process. And it's like,
We have seen evidence of repentance.
yes, yes, he's changed. And they go, no, he hasn't. Screw you. And there's a lot of that as well. There's a lot of families will see you if you leave these churches as being damned to hell and being condemned to hell. You've left fundamentalist evangelicalism and now you are in the Anglican church. It's, are you a secret Catholic? Like, are
This was a serious concern of when I moved from like my Southern Baptist childhood to Anglican churches, and even went to Wheaton College. I remember my like youth pastors sitting down with me to be like, "We're very concerned about the liberal drift that you will have at Wheaton College." And if you know anything about Christian universities, Wheaton is not known for being the most liberal or progressive place. It's not your Bob Jones or your Pensacola State, but it not Pensacola State, that's the wrong one. But is that the right one? I don't remember. It's not your Bob Jones, it's not your Oral Roberts, but it's also not a state university. It is still a Christian Orthodox university. And it was very concerning
yes,
to some of my
yes.
church leaders that I was going there.
And that's, you fell away from this. You have now fallen away from God, or you have been led astray. Or another thing, you're leading your family astray. You're not just condemning yourself, you're condemning your kids, you're condemning your wife,
Mhm.
you're condemning your husband, type of thing. And
Like
it's
I had a
brutal.
very I think my experience leaving our high control church in my 30s is more of an outlier, but I don't know if that fits better in a different topic.
Yeah, that'll be next episode.
Okay.
Yeah, that's basically what the fallout is like. It is, sometimes it's a clean break, sometimes it's pretty easy, especially if you like break from it in university. You'll probably have fallout or an uncomfortable times with your family, and like it'll probably just be that thing you guys don't talk about that everyone knows. That's how it is for my family. They I remember taking my mother to the Anglo Catholic church that I went to, and she went, very Catholic, very Catholic. My mother's from England, though, and so the Anglican tradition really isn't something that scares her or surprises her. Lucky in that sense. But yeah, often it can be pretty brutal, especially if you are intertwined with a church. If you're not intertwined with a church, you can pull out pretty easily. If your friends aren't all at that church, or if you just don't have friends, like
Oh no.
some guys I talk to are like, yeah, it was pretty easy for me. I didn't really have friends at church. What did I leave? A toxic environment where people were mean to me. Great. Did not missing a whole lot.
It's a lot harder to leave a toxic environment where people are nice to you.
Yes, correct. Way
That is
harder.
much harder.
Yes. And we'll talk about that a lot more next episode. But we are almost at the 2 hour mark here. I think that's a short episode for Christianity on the spectrum, but probably where most people's attention spans have cut off. So we will save the high control, high demand religion for next episode. Anyway, thank you very much for coming on the episode, Alyssa. Do you have anything that you would like to plug, or anywhere that the good people of this podcast can find you if you'd like?
I am, I don't have a public thing that I have to promote. I have to, like, to the point that I have to look up my own Blue Sky handle to know what it is. It is, yes, I am on Blue Sky if people want to talk. Alyssa K, that's Alyssa dot bluesky dot social or dot bsky dot social. That's what it is.
Cool. And I am John. You can find me on Gmail, christianityonthespectrum at gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn. You can find me on Blue Sky at ChristianityOn. You can join our great Discord, of which Alyssa is a member. We do.
It's a really good
It's
Discord.
a great time. We do book studies now. We did a two-parter on Simone Weil's Awaiting God, which I thought was very good. And we are currently reading From Shame to Sin, which is a book about the development of Christian sexual ethics in late antiquity. Fun.
That is the kind of fun at parties we are.
Yes.
Fun at very particular parties.
Yes. And you also get to see many of the tweets that I didn't send, but thought were funny to send. So there you go.
The ones that John decided were too hardcore for the
Yes.
general public.
Yeah, that only the autists will understand, so I'll only send them to the autists. That's where you can find us. Those are all the things. See you later.